Lena stood in the kitchen, staring at the row of dishes lined up neatly across the counter, her fingers still slightly trembling despite the fact that everything was already finished. Roasted chicken with herbs, creamy mashed potatoes, a light vegetable sauté, and the dessert, apple tart, golden and perfectly glazed. She had started cooking at noon. It was now almost 7. From the dining room, she could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second stretching longer than it should. The house felt too quiet, too polished, like everything inside it had been carefully arranged long before she ever stepped into it. This was Margaret's house. Of course it was perfect. Lena wiped her hands on a towel, even though they were already clean, and took a slow breath. Tonight mattered more than she wanted to admit. Because in the 2 years she had been married to Daniel, there was one thing she had never quite managed to earn: his mother's approval. Margaret wasn't cruel. That would have been easier to understand. She didn't raise her voice, didn't criticize directly, didn't create scenes. Instead, she observed. Always with that composed expression. That faint, polite smile that never revealed what she was truly thinking. Interesting choice, she would say sometimes, glancing at Lena's outfit. Or, that's one way to do it. When Lena tried something new in the kitchen. Never wrong. Never rude. But never warm either. And somehow, that quiet distance felt heavier than any argument. Lena picked up the serving tray, adjusting the plates one last time so everything looked balanced. Not too crowded. Not too sparse. Just right. Because tonight, for the first time, she hadn't brought dessert. She hadn't offered to help. She had cooked everything herself. A small, determined smile flickered across her face. If Margaret was going to judge her, then at least tonight, she would have something real to judge. Footsteps echoed softly from the hallway. Daniel appeared in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened slightly. He smiled when he saw her, the kind of easy, reassuring smile that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. "Hey," he said gently. "You've been in here all day. Everything okay?" Lena nodded quickly. "Yeah, just finishing up." He stepped closer, glancing at the dishes. "Wow, this looks amazing." There was genuine admiration in his voice. No hesitation. No hidden meaning. Lena felt a small wave of relief, but it didn't last long. Because Daniel wasn't the one she was worried about. From somewhere deeper in the house, she heard the soft, measured sound of heels against hardwood floors. Margaret. Right on time. Lena's grip tightened slightly on the edge of the counter. Daniel didn't seem to notice. He leaned in, pressing a quick kiss to her temple. "Relax," he whispered. "It's just dinner." Lena forced a small smile. Just dinner. If only it felt that simple. The footsteps grew closer, steady and unhurried, until Margaret finally appeared at the entrance of the dining room. She paused there for a moment, taking in the scene, the table, the food, Lena standing beside it. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes lingered, carefully, quietly, as if she were already forming an opinion Lena hadn't yet heard. And somehow, without a single word spoken, the room felt heavier. Margaret had always mastered the art of silence. Not the uncomfortable kind. Not the kind that demanded attention or explanation. Hers was a quiet, deliberate silence, the kind that made people question themselves. Lena had noticed it from the very beginning. The first time they met, Margaret had welcomed her with a polite smile, a gentle handshake, and a compliment that somehow felt incomplete. "You're different from what I expected," she had said. At the time, Lena had laughed nervously, unsure whether that was good or bad. 2 years later, she still wasn't sure. It wasn't that Margaret treated her poorly. In fact, to anyone watching from the outside, Margaret was the picture of grace. She asked the right questions. She remembered birthdays. She never raised her voice. But there was always something just beneath the surface. A pause that lasted a second too long. A glance that lingered just a little too carefully. A choice of words that sounded polite, but felt like they meant something else. "You must be very busy," Margaret had once said when Lena mentioned ordering takeout after work. Another time, while watching Lena struggle with a complicated recipe, she had simply remarked, "Cooking becomes easier with practice." Statements that, on their own, were harmless. But together, over time, They formed a pattern Lena couldn't ignore. It was like being evaluated without ever being told the criteria. And the hardest part? Daniel never saw it. "Mom likes you," he would say casually whenever Lena tried to explain the strange tension she felt. "She's just reserved." Reserved. Lena had repeated that word to herself more times than she could count. Maybe that was all it was. Maybe she was overthinking. But tonight didn't feel like overthinking. Tonight felt like a test. Lena stepped into the dining room, carefully placing the dishes onto the table one by one. She adjusted the plates, straightened the utensils, made sure everything looked effortless. Even though nothing about this evening felt that way. Margaret had already taken her seat. Back straight, hands resting lightly in her lap. Watching. Not openly staring. Just watching. "Did you make all of this?" Margaret asked finally, her voice calm, almost neutral. Lena nodded, forcing her shoulders to relax. "Yes. I thought I'd try something different tonight." A brief pause. Margaret's gaze moved across the table. Chicken, vegetables, potatoes, the dessert waiting quietly at the edge. Then she gave a small nod. "That's ambitious." The word landed softly, but not gently. Lena felt it settle somewhere in her chest, heavy and uncertain. Daniel pulled out his chair, completely at ease. "It smells incredible, Mom. You should have seen Lena. She's been cooking all day." "Is that so?" Margaret replied, her tone unchanged. Her eyes shifted back to Lena. There it was again, that careful look. Not impressed. Not unimpressed. Just measuring. Lena smiled, though it felt slightly tighter than before. "I wanted everything to be fresh." "Of course," Margaret said. Another pause. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she added, "Though sometimes simpler meals are more forgiving." The room went quiet for half a second. Not long enough for Daniel to notice, but long enough for Lena to feel it. Forgiving. As if mistakes were expected. As if failure was already part of the equation. Lena lowered herself into her seat, smoothing her dress slightly as she did. Her heart was beating a little faster now, but her expression remained composed. If this was a test, then it had already begun. And Margaret hadn't even taken her first bite yet. Lena had imagined this moment so many times that it almost felt unreal now that it was happening. For weeks, she had been planning this dinner. Not just the menu, but every detail. She had woken up early that morning, standing in the quiet kitchen with a notebook in hand, going over each step like it was an exam she couldn't afford to fail. Timing the oven, balancing flavors, making sure nothing was too bold, too bland, too anything that could be questioned. Because with Margaret, everything could be questioned. She had even called her own mother the night before. "Don't overthink it," her mom had said gently. "Just cook with love." Lena had smiled at the time. But now, sitting at the table across from Margaret, she realized love wasn't what she was worried about. Precision was. Control was. Perfection was. Daniel reached for the serving spoon, breaking the silence. "All right, let's eat before everything gets cold." He served himself first, casually, as if this were any other dinner. Then he leaned forward and placed a portion of chicken onto Margaret's plate. "Try this, Mom," he said with a grin. Lena outdid herself. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She looked down at the plate, then at the food. Then finally she picked up her fork. Lena felt her entire body go still. This was it. Margaret cut a small piece of chicken, precise and unhurried. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate either. Just calm, controlled movements, like everything she did. She brought the fork to her mouth. Tasted. And for a brief moment nothing happened. No expression. No reaction. Just silence. Lena's fingers tightened slightly around her glass of water. Daniel, oblivious, had already taken a bite of his own. "Wow," he said immediately. "Okay, this is really good." He turned to Lena, smiling. "Seriously, this might be your best yet." Lena nodded faintly, but her attention never left Margaret. Because Daniel's opinion wasn't the one that mattered tonight. Margaret placed her fork down gently beside her plate. That small, controlled gesture made Lena's heart beat faster. Was something wrong? Was she about to say something? Margaret reached for her napkin, dabbing lightly at the corner of her lips. Then she sat back slightly in her chair. Still composed. Still unreadable. The pause stretched. 1 second. 2. 3. Long enough for Lena's mind to start racing. Too salty. Too dry? Too much seasoning? Not enough. She replayed every step in her head, searching for mistakes she might have missed. Then finally, Margaret spoke. She began slowly. Lena held her breath. Margaret's eyes lifted, meeting Lena's for just a moment. And then, for the first time that evening, she smiled. A real smile. Small, but unmistakably there. Actually very good. The words landed gently in the room. For a split second, Lena didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't even breathe. Because she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Daniel laughed lightly. Well, yeah, I told you. But Lena barely heard him. Her chest tightened, not from anxiety this time, but from something else entirely. Relief. Warm, unexpected, almost overwhelming. For the first time in 2 years. Margaret had approved. Or at least, that's what it felt like. And for that one fragile moment, Lena allowed herself to believe it. The warmth didn't last. It lingered just long enough for Lena to feel it, to let it settle in her chest, to soften the tightness she had been carrying all evening. Actually very good. She repeated the words in her mind, holding on to them like something fragile. Margaret had smiled. Margaret had approved. For the first time since Lena had known her, there had been no hesitation, no vague wording, no careful distance. Just praise. Lena felt her shoulders relax, almost without realizing it. A small breath escaped her lips, the kind you take when you've been holding it for far too long. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice softer than usual. Daniel grinned, clearly pleased. See? I told you she'd love it. He reached for more food, already moving on, already comfortable. But Margaret hadn't picked up her fork again. Instead, she remained seated exactly as she was, calm, composed, her fingers lightly resting against the edge of the table. Watching. Lena didn't notice it at first. She was still caught in that moment of relief, still replaying the compliment, still letting herself enjoy it. Until Margaret spoke again. Just like when I first learned how to cook. The words were delivered smoothly, effortlessly, almost as if they naturally belonged after the compliment. But something about them shifted the air in the room. Lena blinked. Her smile didn't disappear, but it paused. Just slightly. Margaret continued, her tone thoughtful, almost reflective. Simple, she added gently, glancing down at the plate for a brief second, but promising. Silence. Not loud. Not dramatic. But sharp in a way that only Lena seemed to feel. Daniel didn't react right away. He was still chewing, still relaxed, still unaware that anything had changed. But Lena felt it instantly. The warmth from a moment ago cooled, like a candle flickering out. Simple. Promising. Not excellent. Not impressive. Not even really good. Just the beginning. A first attempt. A polite way of saying, "You're not there yet." Her fingers tightened slightly around her fork. For a second, she wasn't sure how to respond. Was that still a compliment? Or had it just been reframed? Margaret lifted her glass of water, taking a small sip as if nothing unusual had been said. As if she hadn't just turned approval into something else entirely. Lena forced a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes this time. I see, she said softly. Daniel finally looked up, glancing between the two of them. What? He asked, half laughing. That's still a compliment, right? Margaret turned to him with a calm expression. Of course it is. And maybe to him it was. Maybe to anyone else sitting at that table, it would have sounded kind. Encouraging, even. But Lena felt the difference. It was subtle. Precise. Carefully measured. Just like everything Margaret said. Praise, with a ceiling. Approval, with a condition. Lena lowered her gaze to her plate, the food she had spent hours preparing now looking slightly different to her. Not worse. Just smaller. And for the first time that evening, she realized something. This wasn't just dinner. It never had been. It was a test. And Margaret had just made it very clear. Lena had passed. But only barely. Daniel laughed. It was light, easy, completely unaware of the weight that had just settled over the table. See, he said, pointing his fork playfully toward Lena. Mom's basically saying you're improving fast. Lena let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Basically, she echoed. But inside, something had shifted. Just minutes ago, she had felt relief, real, genuine relief. The kind that loosens your chest and makes everything feel lighter. Now that feeling was gone, replaced by something quieter, something sharper. She glanced down at her plate again, studying the food she had prepared so carefully. The chicken still looked perfect. The potatoes smooth and creamy, just the way she intended. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything felt different. Margaret resumed eating, calm and unbothered, as if the conversation had been entirely ordinary. Cooking is a process, she continued after a moment, her tone conversational. It takes time to develop instinct. Technique can only take you so far. Lena nodded slowly. I understand, she said. And she did. More than Margaret probably realized. Because this wasn't just about cooking. It never had been. It was about position. About experience. About reminding Lena, gently, politely, that she was still new. Still learning. Still below. Daniel reached over and squeezed Lena's hand under the table, giving it a quick reassuring press. Don't listen to her too much, he said with a grin. This is amazing. I mean it. Lena turned her hand slightly, squeezing back. I know, she said softly. And she did know. Daniel's support was real. Warm. Uncomplicated. But it didn't erase what had just happened. Because Margaret's words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They settled in quietly, like something meant to stay. Lena picked up her fork again, taking a small bite this time. She chewed slowly, thoughtfully. Then she set it down. For a brief moment, she said nothing. And in that silence, something inside her began to change. Not hurt. Not exactly. More like clarity. She looked up again, this time meeting Margaret's gaze directly. Not defensively. Not nervously. Just steadily. Margaret noticed. There was the slightest pause in her movement. The smallest shift in her expression. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. And Lena saw it. For the first time that evening, Lena didn't feel like she was being evaluated. She felt like she was observing back. Can I ask you something? Lena said gently. Daniel glanced between them, sensing a shift but not fully understanding it. Margaret placed her fork down again, folding her hands lightly in front of her. Of course. Lena tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, almost curious. When you first learned how to cook, she said, did someone guide you like this? The question hung in the air. Polite. Respectful. But layered. Margaret's eyes held hers for a moment longer this time. And something unspoken passed between them. Recognition. Not confrontation. Not yet. But something closer to it than anything that had come before. The test hadn't ended. It had just changed. Margaret didn't answer immediately. For the first time that evening, her composure didn't disappear, but it shifted. Just slightly. Her fingers remained folded neatly on the table, but her gaze sharpened, focusing on Lena with a new kind of attention. Not distant. Not politely detached. Present. Measuring. In a different way. That's an interesting question, Margaret said at last. Her tone was still calm, still controlled. But there was something beneath it now. Something more deliberate. Lena held her gaze, her posture relaxed, her expression open. She hadn't raised her voice. Hadn't challenged. But she hadn't backed down either. I'm just curious, Lena added lightly. Because you make it sound like learning came with a lot of guidance. Daniel shifted in his seat, glancing between them. He could feel something in the air now. Something subtle but unmistakable. Okay, he said slowly, half smiling. Did I miss something? Neither of them looked at him. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes never leaving Lena's. When I was younger, she began, no one guided me. Her voice was steady, matter of fact. I learned by watching, by making mistakes, by correcting them. A brief pause. Then she added, on my own. Lena nodded. I see. And she did. More clearly now than before. This wasn't just about skill. It was about pride. About a woman who had built herself up without help. and who measured others against that same standard. Lena tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. That must have been difficult, she said. Margaret's eyes flickered, just for a second. Not surprise, but something close to it. Difficult things, Margaret replied, tend to be more valuable. Lena smiled faintly. I agree, she said. Silence settled again, but it felt different this time. Less like pressure, more like balance. Daniel cleared his throat softly, trying to lighten the moment. Well, I'm just glad I didn't have to learn cooking the hard way, he joked. I would have starved. Neither woman laughed immediately. Then Lena let out a small, genuine chuckle. That explains a lot, she said, glancing at him. Daniel grinned, relieved. Hey, rude. The tension loosened, just a little. But Margaret was still watching Lena, carefully. And Lena knew it. So she continued, her tone still calm, still respectful. But I also think, Lena said, sometimes learning with someone doesn't make you weaker. Margaret's expression stilled. It just means, Lena added gently, you don't have to prove everything alone. The words were soft, but they carried weight. For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Her gaze didn't harden. It didn't soften either. It simply held, as if she were considering something she hadn't expected to consider tonight. Daniel looked between them again, this time more quietly. He didn't interrupt. Because now, even he could tell, this wasn't about dinner anymore. Margaret finally reached for her glass, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. Then after a pause she spoke. Perhaps, she said. Just one word. But it wasn't dismissive. It wasn't sharp. It was measured, careful. And for the first time, Lena sensed something she hadn't felt before. Not approval. Not yet. But something close to acknowledgement. And somehow, that felt more real than any compliment Margaret had given all night. Lena didn't expect the shift to feel this quiet. There was no dramatic pause, no raised voices, no moment that clearly marked a turning point. And yet something had undeniably changed. It was in the way Margaret sat now. Still composed. Still elegant. But no longer distant. Lena picked up her fork again, this time without hesitation. She took another bite, letting the flavors settle naturally, without overanalyzing them. For the first time that evening, she wasn't tasting the food to judge herself. She was just eating. Across the table, Margaret did the same. But every so often her eyes would lift, not critically, not sharply, but thoughtfully, as if she were reconsidering something. Daniel, sensing the tension had eased, leaned back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. Okay, he said, gesturing toward the table. I just want to point out that this might be the most peaceful dinner we've had in a while. Lena raised an eyebrow slightly. That's your standard for peaceful? He grinned. No one's arguing. That's already a win. Margaret gave a faint, almost amused exhale. Not quite a laugh, but close. And that alone caught Lena's attention. Because it was new. Lena glanced at her, just briefly, and noticed something she hadn't seen before. Margaret wasn't just observing anymore. She was listening. Really listening. The realization settled in slowly, and with it came something unexpected. Confidence. Not the kind that comes from being praised, but the kind that comes from understanding the situation clearly. Lena set her fork down gently. I have to admit something, she said. Daniel looked at her curiously. Oh. Margaret's gaze lifted again, steady. I've been nervous about this dinner all day, Lena continued, her tone calm but honest. Probably more than I should have been. Daniel blinked. Really? Why? Lena gave a small, almost self-aware smile. Because I wanted it to be good enough. The words hung there. Simple, but heavier than they sounded. Margaret didn't interrupt. Lena glanced at her, then back at her plate. I kept thinking about every little detail, she went on. What you might notice. What you might say. A brief pause. Then she added softly. What you might think. Daniel shifted slightly, his expression softening. Lena. But she shook her head gently. It's okay, she said. I'm not upset. Just honest. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Margaret's fingers moved slightly against the table, a subtle sign of thought. Then after a moment she spoke. You care about doing things well, Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Lena nodded. Ido. Margaret studied her for a second longer. And you care about how you're perceived. Again, not a question. Lena hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then nodded again. Yes. Margaret leaned back slightly, considering. There's nothing wrong with that, she said. The words were calm, even. But they landed differently than before. Because this time there was no hidden edge. No quiet correction attached. Just a statement. Lena blinked, surprised by the simplicity of it. Margaret continued, her tone steady. But if you measure yourself only by what others think, she said, you'll never feel finished. The room grew still again. Not tense. Just quiet. Daniel looked between them, this time without confusion, just curiosity. Lena held Margaret's gaze, absorbing the words. And for the first time since the dinner began, she didn't feel smaller. She felt seen. Not judged. Not compared. Just understood. And somehow, that changed everything. Daniel was the first to break the silence. Well, he said, leaning back slightly, this just turned into the most philosophical dinner I've ever had. His tone was light, teasing, but there was curiosity behind it now. Lena let out a small breath, a hint of a smile returning to her lips. Sorry, she said softly. I didn't mean to make it serious. You didn't, Margaret replied. Lena looked up. Margaret's expression hadn't hardened. If anything, it had softened, just enough to be noticeable. It was already serious, Margaret added calmly. You just chose to say it out loud. That landed differently. Not as criticism, as acknowledgement. Daniel glanced between them again, shaking his head with a quiet laugh. I feel like I should be taking notes. You probably should, Lena said, glancing at him. Hey, he protested lightly. I'm just here to eat. That finally earned a small, genuine smile from Lena. And this time, Margaret noticed it. There was a brief pause as Margaret picked up her fork again, taking another bite. Slower this time. More deliberate. Not evaluating. Experiencing. Then she set the fork down and looked at Lena once more. You said you wanted this to be good enough, Margaret said. Lena nodded, a bit more steady now. Yes. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Good enough for what? The question was simple, but it cut deeper than anything else that had been said. Lena opened her mouth, then stopped, because for the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. Not a real one. She had thought she knew. To impress Margaret. To prove herself. To feel accepted. But hearing the question out loud made those reasons feel incomplete. I don't know, Lena admitted quietly. Daniel blinked, surprised. Really? Lena gave a small, honest shrug. I thought I did. But now, I'm not sure. Margaret watched her closely. Not with judgment. With interest. That's not a bad thing, Margaret said after a moment. Lena's eyes lifted again. Not knowing, Margaret continued. It means you're starting to question the right things. There it was again. No edge. No hidden message. Just clarity. Lena felt something loosen inside her. Something she hadn't realized she had been holding on to for a long time. She let out a quiet breath. I think, she said slowly, choosing her words more carefully now. I wanted to feel like I belonged here. The room stilled. Daniel's expression softened immediately. Lena, you do. She shook her head gently, not dismissing him, just pausing him. I know you think that, she said kindly. But sometimes it's not about what you say. Her eyes shifted to Margaret. It's about what you feel. The words were calm, not accusing, just honest. Margaret didn't respond right away. Her gaze held Lena's again, but this time, there was no distance left in it. Only thought. Careful, quiet thought. Daniel stayed silent. For once, he didn't try to fix the moment. Because even he could tell. This wasn't something that needed fixing. Margaret's fingers moved slightly against the table. A subtle sign of something shifting beneath her composed exterior. Then slowly she spoke. Belonging, she said almost to herself, is not something someone gives you. Lena listened. It's something you decide to take. The words were steady, certain. and somehow, they felt less like a lesson, and more like an invitation. Lena let those words settle. Asterisk belonging is not something someone gives you. It's something you decide to take. Asterisk. For a moment she didn't respond. Not because she didn't understand, but because she did. More than she expected to. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, no longer tense, no longer gripping. The need to impress, to prove, to measure every reaction, it had begun to fade. Not completely, but enough. I think, Lena said slowly, her voice quieter now, but steadier than before. I've been waiting for permission. Daniel looked at her, confused. Permission? Lena nodded faintly. To feel comfortable, she clarified. To feel like I'm enough here. Her eyes shifted briefly to Margaret, then back to the table. And maybe that's why everything felt like a test. The word lingered. Test. Margaret didn't interrupt. But something in her posture changed, just slightly. Less rigid. More present. Lena continued, her tone calm, not defensive, not emotional, just honest. Every comment, every look. I kept trying to interpret it. Trying to understand what you meant, what you expected. She gave a small, almost self-aware smile. And maybe I made it more complicated than it needed to be. Daniel exhaled softly, running a hand through his hair. I had no idea it felt like that, he admitted. Lena glanced at him gently. I didn't really say it out loud before. That silence, that unspoken tension, had lived between them for a long time. But now it was out. Clear. Visible. Margaret's gaze rested on Lena, thoughtful and steady. When you came into this family, Margaret said slowly, you entered something that already existed. Her tone wasn't cold. It was reflective. There were habits, expectations, ways of doing things that had been there long before you. Lena nodded. I know. And I didn't make that easy for you, Margaret added. That made Lena look up. Really look at her. Because that was new. Margaret continued, her voice even but quieter now. I assumed you would adapt, she said. The same way I did once. A brief pause. But I didn't consider that, she hesitated just slightly. Times are different. People are different. Daniel blinked, clearly surprised. Mom. Margaret didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on Lena. I wasn't trying to make you feel unwelcome, she said. And for the first time, there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not authority. Not evaluation. Something closer to honesty. Lena held her gaze, searching it. Not for approval this time, but for truth. And she found it. I believe you, Lena said quietly. No tensión. No resistance. Just acceptance. Margaret gave a small nod. As if that acknowledgement mattered more than she expected. Then she glanced down briefly at the table. The dishes, the meal Lena had prepared. This dinner, she said, was never just about the food. Lena let out a soft breath. I figured. A faint smile touched Margaret's lips. Not sharp. Not distant. Just real. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not a resolution. Not a perfect understanding. But a shift. A step away from testing. And toward something else entirely. Margaret reached for her fork again, but this time, there was no pause filled with evaluation. No careful inspection. No silent judgment. She simply took a bite. And for the first time that evening, it felt like she was eating the meal, not analyzing it. Daniel noticed it too. He leaned slightly toward Lena, lowering his voice just enough to be playful. I think you broke her, he whispered. Lena gave him a small nudge under the table. Stop. But she couldn't help the faint smile that followed. Because something had changed. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But undeniably. Margaret set her fork down again, glancing briefly at Daniel before returning her attention to Lena. You said earlier, she began, that you wanted this to be good enough. Lena nodded slowly. Yes. Margaret tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. I think, she said, you chose the wrong standard. Lena blinked slightly, but this time, she didn't tense. Maybe, Lena replied. Margaret's gaze softened, just enough to be felt. Not everything needs to be measured against someone else's expectations, she continued. Especially not in your own home. That caught Lena off guard. Your own home. The words settled differently, because for so long, Lena had felt like a guest here. Someone stepping carefully, trying not to disrupt what already existed. But Margaret had just reframed it. Not as Margaret's house. Not as a place Lena needed to earn her way into. But as something shared. Daniel leaned back, clearly intrigued now. Okay, I definitely missed a few chapters here, he said. When did this turn into life advice night? Margaret gave him a brief glance. You could benefit from listening. Wow, he laughed. Noted. Lena looked between them, then back at Margaret. And what should I measure things by? She asked gently. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She took a moment, as she always did. But this time, the pause didn't feel like distance. It felt like consideration. Then she said, by whether it reflects who you are. Lena's expression stilled. Margaret continued, her voice calm, but more open than it had been all evening. You cooked this meal carefully, she said, gesturing lightly toward the table. Not because you enjoy cooking the most, but because you wanted it to mean something. Lena swallowed softly. That's not a weakness, Margaret added. It's intention. The word lingered. Attention. Not effort. Not performance. Something deeper. Daniel nodded slowly, as if the pieces were finally coming together for him. Okay, yeah, that actually makes sense. Lena let out a quiet breath. I think I forgot that, she admitted. Margaret's eyes met hers again. It's easy to forget, she said. And this time, there was no distance left in her voice. No hidden edge. Just understanding. Lena looked down at the table once more. At the dishes she had spent hours preparing. At the small details she had worried over. They didn't feel smaller anymore. They felt hers. And for the first time that night, that felt like enough. Daniel stretched slightly in his chair, glancing around the table as if seeing it differently now. Okay, he said, exhaling with a small laugh. I'm just going to say it. This is not how I expected tonight to go. Lena looked at him amused. What were you expecting? I don't know, he shrugged. Food. Small talk. Maybe Mom judging my life choices a little. Margaret gave him a brief look. I can still do that if you'd like. Daniel raised his hands quickly. No, I'm good. That earned a quiet, almost hidden smile from Lena. And this time Margaret didn't miss it. The atmosphere at the table had softened in a way that felt natural now. Not forced. Not fragile. Just easier. Lena leaned back slightly, her shoulders no longer tense, her posture no longer careful. For the first time since arriving, she wasn't thinking about what came next. She was just there. Margaret reached for her glass again, taking a small sip before setting it down. Then after a brief pause she spoke. There's something else, she said. Lena looked up. Margaret's gaze held hers, not sharp, not distant, but steady. When I said your cooking reminded me of when I first learned, she continued. I meant it. Lena didn't react immediately. Because this time, she wasn't rushing to interpret the words. She simply listened. Margaret folded her hands lightly in front of her. It wasn't meant to diminish what you did, she said. It was recognition. That surprised Lena. Margaret went on, her voice calm but more open than before. When I was learning, I cared about every detail the same way you did tonight, she said. Every step mattered. Every outcome felt important. A small pause. And I remember how that felt. Lena's expression softened. Because now the words sounded different. Not like a comparison. Like a memory. I didn't say it well, Margaret admitted. That made Daniel blink. Wait, are you apologizing? Margaret glanced at him briefly. Don't make it sound so rare. It is rare, he said, grinning. Lena let out a quiet laugh, but her attention stayed on Margaret. You don't have to apologize, Lena said gently. Margaret shook her head slightly. Perhaps not. But I prefer to be clear. And that felt important. Clear. No hidden meaning. No laertoon. Just honesty. Margaret looked at the table again, then back at Lena. You did well tonight, she said. Simple. Direct. No editions. No conditions. Lena felt something settle in her chest. Not the fragile relief from earlier, not the uncertain warmth. Something steadier. Something she didn't have to question. Thank you, she said, and this time, her voice didn't waver. Daniel looked between them, smiling. Okay, I'm officially declaring this the best dinner we've had. Margaret raised an eyebrow slightly. Because of the food? Daniel shook his head. No. Because no one's secretly keeping score anymore. There was a brief silence. Then Lena spoke softly. I think we all were. Margaret didn't deny it. She simply gave a small, acknowledging nod. And somehow, that quiet agreement felt like the most honest moment of the night so far. The plates were nearly empty by the time the conversation began to slow. Not because the food had disappeared quickly, but because no one had rushed through it. Dinner had unfolded differently than any of them expected. Slower. Heavier in some moments. Lighter in others. And now, as the evening settled into a quiet calm, something in the room felt complete. Lena stood up first, gathering a few of the dishes almost instinctively. I'll take these to the kitchen, she said. Daniel started to rise. I'll help. But Margaret spoke before he could move. Sit, she said calmly. Both of them looked at her. Margaret stood. I'll help her. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything else she had said that night. Lena paused for a moment, surprised. Then she nodded. Okay. The two of them walked into the kitchen together, side by side, without another word. For a few seconds, only the sound of running water filled the space. Lena placed the plates carefully into the sink, turning slightly to reach for a towel. Margaret stood beside her, rolling her sleeves just slightly. An unspoken readiness to do something she hadn't offered before. I usually don't let guests clean up, Margaret said. Lena glanced at her, a small smile forming. I don't usually feel like a guest anymore. Margaret's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. Then she nodded. Good, she said. No hesitation. No correction. Just acceptance. They worked in quiet rhythm after that. Passing plates, rinsing, drying. Not awkward. Not forced. Just natural. After a moment, Margaret spoke again. You handled yourself well tonight, she said. Lena looked at her, this time without uncertainty. I think I finally stopped trying to prove something, Lena replied. Margaret considered that. That's when it becomes easier, she said. Lena smiled faintly. For both sides, I think. Margaret didn't disagree. They finished the last dish in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not filled with unspoken tension, but with something steadier, something understood. When they returned to the dining room, Daniel looked up at them, clearly trying to read what had happened in their absence. So, he said cautiously, should I be worried or relieved? Lena laughed softly. Relieved? Margaret took her seat again, smoothing her hands lightly over the table. Yes, she said. Relieved. Daniel leaned back, exhaling dramatically. Good. I prefer that outcome. Lena sat down across from Margaret once more. But this time, the distance between them felt different. Smaller. Not because anything had been erased, but because something had been built. Margaret glanced at Lena, her expression calm, but no longer unreadable. Next time, she said, we can cook together. Lena blinked slightly, then smiled. I'd like that. And she meant it. Because that invitation wasn't about cooking. It was about something far more important. Not approval. Not perfection. But a quiet understanding that had taken time to reach. Lena looked around the table one last time, then back at Margaret. And she realized something simple. That night hadn't been about earning a place in the family. It had been about claiming it. And finally, she had.